To the extent that they do, however, they would probably, most of them, agree that the prisoners need both religion and civilization, whether or not they share IFI's biblicist theology. But there was much that was unresolved at the trial about the nature of conversion. Whenever the government is involved in the remaking of persons, whether in substance abuse programs, teen intervention, or prisons, it is arguably engaged in a religious activity, broadly understood, unless one subscribes to an entirely naturalist and behavioralist anthropology. Indeed, the complaining prisoners themselves, Lutherans, Roman Catholics, Muslims, Jews, and Native Americans, were not opposed to religion or even religious proselytization. They wanted to be better Lutherans, Roman Catholics, Muslims, Jews, and Native Americans, and they wanted to choose, and they wanted to be able to do more than one at the same time. They felt discriminated against by the evangelicals of IFI, and they would have liked to have a choice among religious programs. But the politics of prison reform and the diversity of religion in the US, combined with a fierce disestablishmentarianism, makes it impossible to satisfy such a demand, even if research showed that such programs are effective. So the default position in US prisons is that formal training programs should be secular, with religion being accommodated through the voluntary efforts of outside religious groups whose activities are managed by a non-confessional prison chaplain. Because prisoners are within the control of the government, they cannot avail themselves of a true free market in religion, that which is understood to be guaranteed by the US Constitution and which is understood to be desirable by almost all Americans. So the prison, like the armed services, is a place where the US government is required to supply and manage religion, and establishment is arguably unavoidable. So that even Free Church Protestants are drawn into creating religion in these places as a socially comprehensive effort. And thus one has the peculiar situation in the US of a Protestant evangelical prison program being condemned by a Catholic judge for replicating a Catholic monastery. And that's the words that the judge used. Jim Beckford's recent work comparing the accommodation of Islam in the prisons of England and France provides an interesting contrast. Beckford compares the modest English success in addressing the needs of Muslim prisoners in Her Majesty's prisons, where an established religious bureaucracy provides an umbrella for the accommodation of a variety of religious services, with the utter failure of the French prisons to do the same. The critical difference is the church-state model. English prisons have successfully introduced halal food, provisions for worship services, and pastoral counseling by imams, and the training of every prison officer in Her Majesty's prisons on the basic tenets of Islamic practice. But an established church in the UK makes possible the use of government resources and elite expertise to address prisoners' religious lives. French prisons, on the other hand, do not officially know of the presence of Muslim prisoners because French citizens are not identified by religious affiliation. They do not legally know their citizens as having religious lives. While estimates of the percentage of prisoners in French prisons who are Muslim are as high as 50%, no official provision is made for the religious needs of those prisoners, so the prisoners themselves supply the lack with religious leadership from among the prisoners, with the results you can imagine. In one sense, one might see the US as midway between the established legal regime of the UK and the laïcisme of the French state. To be religious is not seen to threaten the state in the US as it is in France and Turkey, but neither are Americans comfortable with religion being managed by the government as it is in many other countries. Americans are much less statist than either France or the UK. And as a result, the making of good citizens and good religious persons is largely the result of, and I want to underline this, amateur entrepreneurial effort. So that the prisoners of the United States prisons are being turned over to largely well-meaning but largely ignorant people. India, I think, also falls between the established and laicist mode, being more like the US. And I don't know anything about religion in Indian prisons, and I would be very interested in learning if anybody can help me. So let me conclude now with a few remarks. In 1988, the Supreme Court of Japan held in the Nakaya case that the National Veterans Association had a constitutional right to posthumously convert a deceased veteran, by apotheosizing him at Yasukuni Shrine, over the objections of his Christian wife and Buddhist parents, both of whom asserted that he was a completely non-religious person. And both, by the way, having already honored him according to the traditions of their own religious communities, dividing his ashes between them. The Japanese majority in the Nakaya case said that the veterans, and by implication the state, had a constitutional right to religious freedom. Social harmony, they implied, was to be promoted by allowing multiple religious interpretation of Mr. Nakaya's death to coexist, even multiple posthumous conversions. Such a conclusion is shocking to most Americans who understand families to own the bodies and the souls of their deceased relatives, and religious identity to be singular. Thus, the efforts of Mormons posthumously to baptize non-Christians, especially Jews, is regarded as a strange and abusive practice by many Americans. So much so that Mormons have actually officially agreed to stop baptizing Jews posthumously, although they do posthumously baptize the rest of us. We seem to be living in a time in which particularist religious identities are mattering in a new way. Military chaplains in the U.S. during World War II were famous for ministering to each other's co-religionists. There are myriad stories of rabbis delivering the last rites of the Catholic Church to dying Catholic soldiers, or of Protestant ministers reciting the Kaddish for dying Jewish soldiers. Today, however, 700 evangelical chaplains are suing the U.S. Navy because they say they are discriminated against by the Navy's theological liberalism. They are denied promotions and plum preaching occasions because the Navy's theology is one of universal salvation. The evangelical chaplains claim the constitutional right to preach the exclusivity of salvation in Jesus Christ, to evangelize soldiers and others who might be on the base. Secularists cannot answer this claim without sacrificing their own commitment to religious freedom, rooted as it is in free speech. One cannot, I think, sort out the religious and the secular descriptively. Secularism as a political solution to pluralism only produces confessionalism, artificial essentializing of religion and politics that denies the essential multiplicity, as I understand it, one that is underlined in the U.S. by an intense egalitarianism, at least ideologically, whether or not in fact. So legal enforcement of rights to religious freedom necessarily, I think, implies a theology and a religious anthropology. Surely these different locations for claims to religious freedom only once more serve to reveal the shortcomings of universal rights when it comes to religion. While religion, whatever we mean by that, may be present in all human societies, the impossibility, in the absence of legally established authorities, of locating and defining religion makes rights to religious freedom rather crude instruments of legal regulation. Secular courts and legislators have no way of distinguishing between, in American terms, people of faith and people not of faith, and they have even less capacity to identify the orthodoxy of particular individuals or practices. But 19th century Irish Catholic famine victims, like those in various parts of the world today, surely should not have been required to convert in order to receive food aid. U.S. prisoners should not have to recite Bible verses in order to receive training in anger management and substance abuse counseling. It is the quid pro quo in situations of asymmetrical power that are troubling. Otherwise, we try to persuade each other of our peculiar views all the time, and probably that should be tolerated and even supported by government, within reason. My own view is that in the U.S. case, law should ignore religion, regulating all activity, whether or not religious, through general laws, without an effort to protect or to discriminate among religions. Religious actors and communities should receive no special legal treatment, positive or negative, because they are religious. U.S. religion is too fragmented and too vociferous to admit of regulation. But that is not the current trend in the U.S. The current trend in the U.S. is toward a new establishment, one that understands all persons as religious, or sometimes spiritual is the word that's used. In hospitals, prisons, schools, and even the workplace, the American citizen is increasingly understood to be in need of pastoral care, and American religious institutions are changing to meet this new social and legal reality. Like my solution, this new establishment is radically egalitarian, however, respecting the radical U.S. constitutional commitment to equality and a shallow historical sensibility, maybe one of the biggest differences with the rest of the world. In the U.S., either we are all religious or we are all not. But neither American solution seems universal. The rule of law, if it is to be our one global commitment, needs to be tailored to local conditions. Thank you.